If you've heard about this term, dopamine detox, wondering if you need one or wondering what the heck it is, then this video's for you. Let's dive in. In a world where we're often overstimulated by things like social media, video games, heck, even junk food, it's often easy for us to be overwhelmed, overstimulated, but yet also unhappy and not actually find pleasure from these things anymore. Well, that's where the idea of something like a dopamine detox comes into play. Now, a dopamine detox is a kind of widely used, kind of broad term where we're generally meaning that people are abstaining from activities that are usually giving us those short, quick hits of dopamine. So abstaining from things like video games, things like pornography, things like alcohol, things like social media scrolling, TikTok, and you found yourself like going down a YouTube rabbit hole and like an hour later and you don't even know what you watch. So things like that. And the idea is that because we have this overstimulation or this kind of constant release of dopamine, it takes higher or increasing amounts of dopamine to get pleasure from activities that we used to do that would give us pleasure at the time. And the idea is that by abstaining from these activities for a period of time, we actually start to reset our natural levels of dopamine. And that by going on this dopamine detox or resetting our baseline level of dopamine, we can then improve our focus, improve our motivation, and ultimately improve our overall well-being. So let's back up first and talk a little bit about what dopamine does and the importance of dopamine. So dopamine is a neurotransmitter and it helps to signal things to happen in your brain, crudely put. Dopamine is important because it has many crucial functions in areas of movement. It helps with learning, memory, and even motivation. So it plays many different roles in the body. And more commonly known, it's associated with our reward or our pleasure center of our brain. So when we do something pleasurable like eating or playing a video game, or having sex, dopamine gets released in the brain, and then our brain is reinforcing this behavior because it was a pleasurable activity. And again, that makes us more likely to do it again in the future. So that's how we get this pleasure reward cycle. And again, as I mentioned, in other areas, it's also used for movement. So a lack of dopamine or a problem with dopamine can lead to movement disorders, so diseases like Parkinson's. But that is generally coming from a different area of the brain. Also, what's interesting is dopamine is often involved in areas of memory, in motivation, and in learning and other areas of cognition. So a lot of times people are advocating for dopamine detox because you've done too many of these pleasurable things, you've overstimulated yourself, and now you're actually lacking motivation. You're actually having trouble with memory because I guess in a way dopamine has been abused. And your levels are high and we kind of need to reset your base level. Now, that leads us back to, okay, well then what is a dopamine detox and do I need to do it? Now, more and more research is emerging about dopamine and dopamine detoxes, whether it's important. But what I can say is that there are actually some things that can actually help to reset these base levels of dopamine. So first I'll say in this dopamine detox, is abstaining from the things that you're trying to change. So if you're overindulging on scrolling on the internet, I'm using this one because this is what I do. So no judgment. So if you're scrolling too much, then taking that out and trying to abstain from that is the first kind of step in this dopamine detox. Outside of abstaining from all the joyful activities or all the mindless scrolling on TikTok, what we can actually do are a few simple things. So first is to go out in nature, spend some time in the quiet, sit down and meditate. In a way, the goal here is to actually bring your awareness within and stop kind of looking outward and being stimulated from something outside of yourself. Another interesting way in resetting baseline levels of dopamine is to actually do cold immersion. Studies have shown that after time, this actually raises your baseline level of dopamine. Another really interesting thing has to do with the way that you approach your work. And one of the studies I've seen talks about working on really hard things without doing it for the pleasure of doing the thing, which doesn't make a lot of sense, but it means working on something that's difficult or mentally challenging without any expectation. I like to think about this as just focusing on the quality of your effort and not really having any attachment to the outcome. Apparently, having this sort of mindset or approach can actually start to reset your levels of dopamine, which is very interesting. Because so many times we're doing things because we want the outcome, right? But instead, switching it and focusing on doing the hard thing, working through the hard thing without Any expectation can actually help to reset that baseline level of dopamine and probably leading later to more motivation to do something. So very interesting. Another way is kind of focusing more on a supplemental or nutritional aspect, and that's making sure you have enough B12, because to produce dopamine, we need methyl donors, and B12 is a great methyl donor. So focusing on your nutrition is another way. You would also need folic acid as well as magnesium, just as a side note. So maybe adding these as supplementation. Again, always talk with your practitioner before adding new supplements or herbs. And then also making sure that your COMT or COMT is working properly, because we need that for the breakdown as well. Of course, working with your nutrition, again, eliminating the junk food, eliminating the processed foods, increasing your protein actually is helpful. Foods that are rich in phenylalanine, so things like beef, fish, actually chocolate, turkey, eggs, and surprisingly, even intermittent fasting may be helpful in some studies. And another thing you want to do is get up and get moving. Exercise is another way to help with resetting your baseline levels of dopamine, and exercising to the point where you're sweating, so you're having some sort of real effort as well, is important. So those are some of the things, or some of the protocols that are typically involved in what we think about a dopamine detox. Overall, what are we trying to do? We're trying to reset our baseline levels of dopamine so that we can be better focused. So if you're finding yourself not really focusing, or having problems with memory, or having problems like sitting down to do something, a dopamine detox may be something to try. It's not going to hurt anything, and at worst, you get rid of maybe some bad habits. So let me know of your experience with the dopamine detox, if you've heard of this before, if you've experimented with it. And also, I will leave a link down below to Huberman Lab's podcast. He does a wonderful in-depth podcast on dopamine and the dopamine detox. And if you want to go in more depth, that is a great resource. All right. I hope that this video was helpful, and I will see you in the next video. Bye.